All right, welcome to our back to school BTC thin slicing workshop. I'm Kelsey Onofrio. I'm one of the hosts for today. I work at Joseph Milittle Middle School in East Haven.
I'm William McKinney. I am also one of the facilitators, and I work at Engineering and Science University Magnet School in New Haven.
I am Marta Soto-Johnson. I am also one of the facilitators, and I work at Washington Middle School in Meriden, Connecticut.
And all three of us are fellows in the Connecticut Noyce Math Teacher Leader Program. We've been part of this program for the last year, and this is been a really special program for all of us and has given us some really great opportunities to do some things that we would not normally have a chance to do. But the program draws math teachers from the Alliance districts across Connecticut. So because we're spread out all over the state, there's most likely a Noyce Fellow somewhere near your region of Connecticut. So feel free to reach out to any of us. While the three of us are hosting, if you see someone with facilitator at the end of their name, they are also a Noyce Fellow, and there are several more who weren't able to join us today. So one of the really great aspects of the program is that it has really pushed all 20 of us to really shift our focus to more equitable outcomes and instructional practices. And in your landing page, we have a link to the Math Equity Position Statement. It's a joint statement between the State Department, universities, and then also teachers. And it has not been adopted yet, but it is on the slate to be adopted, I think, in September by the state of Connecticut. The universities have already looked at it. So we're going to be talking primarily about pillar one of three pillars today. And if you are interested in learning more about it, there is a link to the equity position statement in your landing page. But pillar one is about supporting math identities in mathematics. And you all have signed up for building thinking classrooms, but not just that, but looking at how thin slicing can help us do that. And so all of us who are facilitating today have been experimenting with thin slicing to some extent over the last year. And some of the biggest things that we saw was that it immensely supported our students' math identities. So sort of within that pillar, it's about ensuring that all students see themselves as capable math learners, giving students opportunities for student agency in all classrooms, and then building from students' personal knowledge, experiences, and attitudes. And throughout today's workshop, you're going to have an opportunity to sort of take on the student perspective, and then you're going to have another opportunity to take on the teacher perspective. So hopefully when you're working as a student, you'll see how thin slicing can really help support a student's math identity.
All right, so the objectives for today's workshop are as follows. Okay, to understand what variation theory is and what role it plays in developing thin slice tasks, to understand how thin slicing empowers students to analyze patterns and make connections between prior learning and new standards, and to develop strategies to create your own thin slice activities using your district's curriculum.
Okay, so in your WebEx screen, at the bottom right-hand corner, there are three dots. You can enable the Q&A panel from there. And in that panel is where we want you to post any questions that you may have as the presentation is going on. General questions will be answered at the end of the workshop, and clarifying questions about directions will be answered in real time.
To the best of our ability, hopefully we'll see it.
All right, so BTC, we should be familiar with it since you are coming to our workshop for thin slicing. So the thinking classroom method of teaching is about student-centered learning where the students do the heavy lifting. So we as teachers promote deeper thinking and the transfer of student knowledge between their peers throughout the classroom. So we are familiar with Toolkit 1, where we initiate student thinking. By giving our students something to think about, we use random groups to break down social norms and barriers, and the use of vertical workspace promotes sharing of the thinking. Then there's Toolkit 2, where we start to foster that student thinking. This gives our students a voice in the classroom because the focus is off of us as the teacher and more on the student. It promotes student autonomy and sharing knowledge and ideas with each other. And then that leads us to toolkit number 3, which is maintaining that student thinking, helping our students look for and use those patterns that are found throughout mathematics. And we can do that, we can keep them in flow by creating well thought out, thin sliced tasks, which is what we are going to be doing today in today's workshop. All right, so we thought it was important to at least touch on the learning theory that grounds the thin sliced work, which is variation theory. Understanding the ideas behind variation theory will help us as teachers design effective tasks. So variation theory is a variation of one dimension against a background of sameness, which creates opportunities to notice and learn about critical aspects of a mathematical object. And this aligns with our math practice standard number 7. Look and make use of structure. So you likely are familiar with tasks designed to leverage variation theory, even if you didn't know that's what it was. And here are 2 examples on the slide. So the first example here is about providing students with examples and non-examples, which helps them attune to what is constant with each of the 2 sets and what varies between the 2 sets. It also gives you an opportunity to realize that what is not important in deciding if something is or is not, in this case, a polygon. The second example, number strings, you can see from the set of examples in the number string that with reflection, there are certain changes to the input number you would like a student to pay attention to. When students can start to coordinate changes in the equations with the changes in the output and think about the why, then you can start developing that number sense.
So I'm going to be introducing you all to exploring variation theory through our first activity, which is going to be the student experience. Now, I've intentionally designed a task from my calculus class because despite the fact that we have a lot of middle school teachers, a lot of high school teachers who don't teach calculus, and then a lot of district leaders or professors who maybe haven't touched calculus in a while, we thought it would actually give the most authentic student experience because it's maybe been a while since we've done calculus. Now, when we mention calculus, I know it might bring up a lot of anxiety for people, especially if it's been like 10, 12, 20, 30 years since you've done it. But the point of this activity is to show you what it's like to be a student and to help you see how this kind of activity can help support students' identities. So even if you're not familiar with this, I guarantee you, because I've done this with 9th graders and 12th graders and an 8th grader as well at my school, all of them have been able to do this task because what you're going to be doing is really exploring what variation theory is and how it can be used to construct your own learning. So we are going to be breaking up into breakout sessions. This is meant to be interactive, and we hope that people will unmute. We are looking to do breakout rooms of about 3 people each, I believe. Marta, hopefully that's working out. But the activity directions are, I'm going to go over quickly. They're also in the landing page. So the first thing you need to do is download the activity. The link to the activity is on your landing page underneath where it says activity 1. It says exploring variation theory activity 1. It's number 4 on your agenda. You are going to be assigned randomly to a breakout room to work through the task in small groups, and you're also going to access this shared Google folder, which is linked in number 2 on your directions. When you go there, you're going to see a folder that says Jamboards. And when you click on that folder, it'll say like group 1 through 3 Jamboard, group 4 through 6 Jamboard, group 7 through 9 Jamboard. When you are put into a breakout room, your breakout room number corresponds with your Jamboard number. So if you're in breakout room 1, you're going to make sure you go to the Jamboard that says groups 1 through 3. Because there are 3 groups in each Jamboard, you might need to scroll to the right. Each slide will be labeled group 1, group 2, group 3. In group on slide 1, Megan, if you can advance the directions, you're going to record your work for the tasks, okay? And there's 4 tasks for you to complete on that first slide of your Jamboard. On the second slide of your Jamboard, you're actually going to type in your whatever you think goes into the notes section. So we are intentionally not telling you what to put there. This is just to see what you come up with. Hopefully you have some really good discussion around it. And then when you finish all of that, you're going to answer the 3 reflection questions that are listed right here. Megan, if you can go forward. So the 3 reflection questions are: what role did variation theory play within individual tasks? What role did variation theory play between tasks? And how were the tasks ordered? And what role did that play in your ability to construct learning? So you don't have to pull out your phone and take pictures. It's all in your landing page. So Marta, when you're ready, you can send people off. And if you have a question about what you're supposed to be doing, just stay here before you join your breakout room and we'll get you squared away.
Okay, so I have shared the landing page link on the chat in case anybody missed it on their email or may have closed it. And at this point, I will start the breakout sessions. All right, welcome back to the main group, everyone. I hope you had a good time in this activity. If you were frustrated, that was part of the intent of this activity. William, take it away.
Yeah, so we had some facilitators jumping in and out of the breakout rooms. And so we're going to ask you all to do one thing, and then we're going to have some of the facilitators share out what they heard. So in the chat, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you would like to jot in some notes for the share out, it's: how was the overall experience for you as a student? And what role did variation theory play in your ability to construct new learning? I know the groups that I was in, I heard there was a little bit of anxiety from not having seen or done calculus in a while, but I was still able to hear some really good conversations around how to do this. So we'll give you a minute to just type into the chat, and then our facilitators, if there are a couple of you, if you want to share maybe like 1 or 2 thoughts that you heard your groups talking about, that would be great. But let's give people a minute to jot in the chat. I'm just going to read out some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat. I like how it started easier, low floor. It made me feel confident to move on to tasks 3 and 4. I know a lot of people got to task 4 and were like, there are no examples. What are we supposed to do? But in some of the groups that I heard, they were like, I think we just use the rules from tasks 1, 2, or the patterns we saw in tasks 1, 2, and 3. So that was great to see. I loved it once we got rolling, and being above 40 years old, it all came back so quickly. But even if I had not seen it ever at all, really great way to introduce the topic. My group worked together and focused on patterns. All were helpful and affirming. As a student, it was great to have a low floor of entry into this. I liked looking at the patterns, right? So that's something that I'm seeing in a lot of the comments. And a big part of this is, right, activating prior learning. For a lot of students, math is so traumatizing because they don't know where to start, because we're trying to meet them up here, because we aren't necessarily activating that prior knowledge right away. And so looking for a pattern is something that all students can try to do, especially if they're working in groups. They might not see the pattern right away, but maybe if they are collaborating with 2, 3 other people, it becomes a little bit easier. Yep, I see someone wrote, everyone can find a pattern. We each contributed a piece and restated our final thoughts. Yep, we definitely needed some more time. I have thin slices. I teach in an 85-minute block, and I use most of it, probably 60 minutes, with some of the thin slices that I do. Other ones are shorter and take much less time. Sort of depends on how you design it. Great experience because we either haven't ever done calculus or we haven't seen it in some time. Working with a group and being able to share ideas allowed for less anxiety. I like that people are touching upon like the anxiety that they had and how this sort of helped reduce that anxiety. Because remember, I want us to go back to that pillar in equity, right? Really supporting students' identities. So do we have one or two facilitators who would like to maybe share out something that they heard in their groups?
Yeah, I had a group talking about the balance of questions. So how many is enough for each task? And you don't want to have too little, you don't want to have too many. I think they came to agree on, 3 is a good number, but I guess it kind of depends on what will establish that learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. And remember, this is the student experience. So Kelsey is going to show you the teacher experience and what it's sort of like to figure out how to build a thin slice. But I will say that it is a lot of experimentation. And for like, once you know who your students are, after you get to know them, right, you're going to say, oh, you know what? For this class, I can get away with like 2 examples or no examples, which is a little bit tougher. But for another group, you might need like 5 or 6. So it sort of just depends on what the students have. Do we have another facilitator who would like to share something out?
We had one group that reflected on that jump between 3 and 4, where just kind of wondering, could there have been maybe one more layer there going from single terms to now an operation? So I thought that was an interesting question.
I love this question because that is really what the next part of this is going to be about, moving from thick to thin and how thick is too thick, right? When you're making your slices. And there are times this past year where I designed thin slices for my students and they weren't able to make the jump because the slices were too thick and I was missing sort of a slice. So that's something that you're going to have to experiment with to figure out like what is too thick, what is too thin, because you also don't want to take the thinking out of it, right? So if you slice too thinly, then there's no need to think anymore. It's just like, okay, I just copy down what's going on. I did find with my calculus classes, all of the groups were able to make the jump. And remember, if you're applying some of the building thinking classrooms practices into your classroom, then there will be this idea of knowledge mobility where if a group gets stuck and they're not sure what to do, they might visit another group and be like, how did you tackle task 4? There weren't any examples. And what I have found is that students will be like, oh, you literally just do the same thing we've been doing, but it's just got pluses and minuses in between. And then they would go right back to their boards and get to work. And it was literally just needed a quick look at someone else. I think we're at our time, so I'm going to go ahead and pass the torch to Kelsey.
I do want to touch base on kind of like that structure of lesson planning and where, how many questions you need, how thin slices have to be too, and just talk about how in the student experience you guys saw a thin slice task in a specific manner. It was on a PDF, it had examples on the left, it had questions for you to answer on the right, and it had no answer key. You just had your PDF. And William shared with me that he would give his students this task in a PDF. So they had all the questions at once. They would move at their own pace and they would check their answers by looking around and looking at the other groups. That's just one way that you guys can structure your tasks. And I'm going to show you a way that I did my thin slicing tasks using a standard that and a lesson that I actually did in my classroom. So when we are teaching as before BTC and now with BTC, we always want to start with our standard. Where are we trying to get our kids to go, that end results? And so I pulled a standard from my 8th grade curriculum, finding volume of a cylinder. So at the end of this lesson, I want my students to be able to answer a question of find the volume of the cylinder. If you can progress the slides, please, Megan. Yep. So this is a question that I would want my students to be able to answer at the end. And so then what I do is I think about the prerequisite. What came before this? What should my students know beforehand? So I found a 7th grade standard on finding the volume of more of a rectangular prism. And so a question from 7th grade would look something like this. And my job now, when I'm trying to create this thin slice activity, is figuring out all the questions that go in between and figuring out that thin slice versus the thick slice. What questions do I need to ask to lead my students from thinking from the 7th grade standard all the way to the 8th grade standard? I might also come up with a prerequisite, a question 0, you might say, that needs to kind of lower that floor a little bit more for all of the students to be able to access and then guide their thinking to that end standard that I have. So on the next slide is an example of a lesson plan. So I'll break it down for you. So I have the prerequisite question, and then I have my end goal, and I'm trying to connect the dots. So if you notice, the prerequisite question is number 2. So I actually backed up a little bit, and I have a question beforehand asking about finding the base. So activating that prior knowledge, I'm leading my students then to use the base to then calculate the volume of a rectangular prism. Question 3, I now introduce a new shape. That's the shape I want them to be able to find the volume of, and ask them to compare the 2 containers. They might do that with a table, similarities, differences, what do you notice, what do you wonder, and they record all of their information on the boards. And then question 4, I now just have them looking at the new cylinder shape, and I'm mirroring the question I asked in question 1. I'm now asking them to find the area of the base of the cylinder, the circle. And then finally, I use the knowledge that, like, what do you know about finding the volume of a rectangular container, and now find the volume of this container. So essentially they're making that connection, base times height. I can do that for a rectangle prism. I can do that for a cylinder. And I might give them more questions, probably about 4 or 5 more questions with variation. I might change the height of the cylinder, then I might change the diameter. I'll give one with radius. I'll give a question with the cylinder on the side so that they still know how to identify the base. And eventually, once I give them a couple of variations of that question, I will give them an extension so that they have established its base times height to find the volume. Does it work with every shape? Here's another figure. Will it work with that too? And then they explore and broaden their connection. They're looking for those patterns and applying them to more information. So this is something that I would print out on paper, as you see here. And I would cut up each of these little squares like a card. I personally will start with question 1 already at their board so they just can get started to work. And then one student will have to go get the next question when their group is ready. And I teach 8th grade, so I personally give them an answer key. So when that one student goes and gets the question 2, they check to see if question 1 was correct in the answer key right there next to the card that they're about to take back to their group. And they'll continue that process. They'll get the next question, they'll check their answer. And I found that it still does support that knowledge mobility and that communication. I had a student who went and checked the answer and found out that their group was wrong, but he knew the answer the whole time, but didn't quite get his point across. And he turns around, goes back to his group, and he was like, I knew it, I was right. And they start having this conversation again about where did they go wrong? Like, how did they fix the problem? And what information did he have? How did he know the right answer? And they fixed their answer on the board and then moved on. So it works really well with 8th grade. William has his methods for his higher level class, but there's even more different ways that you can do this too. It doesn't have to look like what William's example is. It doesn't have to look like mine, but know that it is very fluid. You can come up with your own ideas and even make things even better the next time that you do it. So that leads us to our next activity. So activity 2 is now the teacher experience. So you were just the student earlier. So now you're going to be the teacher. We're going to be moving from thick to thin, like a thick slice to a thin slice. So I just presented you when I looked at the end goal standard and the prerequisite, I showed you a thick slice, and then I showed you how I provided thin slices in between. So that's what you're going to do. So you will be, again, randomly assigned to a breakout room, and you will be accessing another Google folder for activity 2 from the landing page. Every group will have a document. It will say group number in the document, and that's going to match the random group that you are in. So you have edit access and you will be able to type in that document directly. Once you are in your group and you have that doc opened, you are going to see that the doc has the directions already written for you as well. It will show the example that I just went over on the previous slide, and it will have two templates. It will have a proportional reasoning lesson template and a solving equations template. As a group, we ask you to look over the two templates and choose one to work on together as a group. And you are going to create about 1 to 4 slices in between the prerequisite and the final standard. Megan, if you can click the next button so we can show. Yep, so you're going to read the prerequisite standard and the goal standard, and then create 1 to 4 thin slices in between. We want you to, maybe use variation theory within each task, in each box, or between each of the boxes as well. The template will also include a blank square at the beginning if you want to think about that question 0, lowering that floor a little bit and activating that prior knowledge. And then we will come back together and have a little share out.
Are there any questions?
Groups will have about 15 minutes once they're in breakout rooms.
Thank you, Will.
All right, so I have put the link to the activity 2 folder in the chat as well, in case you kind of lost track of your tabs in your screens. And I will start the breakout sessions now.
Oh,
All right, so welcome back, everybody. So we're going to ask you to share out, reflect a little bit on your experience, and in the chat, you can share out the answer to one of the 3 questions we have here on the screen. So how did your group create variation within and between the tasks? How did your group format individual slices? What did you find most helpful? And what do you foresee as the biggest challenge in the creation of thin slice activities? So go ahead, take some time to type your response in the chat and go ahead and share that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start reading some of the comments that I see in the chat while you guys are typing. So it says, we thought first about whether we needed to start with a question 0. That's an excellent point. Sometimes you do have prerequisite knowledge that you do want to spark. Sometimes that first question is good enough. So just really thinking about how low is your floor. Let's see, making sure the slices are not too thick or too thin. That is definitely a challenge. And I think it comes with time when you are planning your lessons. As you are doing these thin slicing tasks, you start to really get into a rhythm. And also you get to know your students and how they think. So you know whether or not you need to put in more of those thin slice questions, or they can make those jumps. Let's see.
Kelsey, I just want to add, in the activity 1, a lot of you mentioned pattern recognition, and that is something that you want to have the students realize, the pattern. So as you develop your thin slices, think about what pattern are they going to develop based on step 1, 2, 3.
Yeah. And that actually leads to one of the comments. It says, by using multiple examples to highlight a pattern, and by adding a difficulty to each slice and knowing how much to scaffold.
I just want to add that I was working with groups 7, 8, and 9, and I was really interested to see that all 3 of those groups were doing the same task. They were all working on solving equations, and each one of the groups approached it in a very different way. Their focus was in a very different place, which first of all made me feel very seen, because I have that struggle a lot when I design these tasks, like which piece of this is most important to me right this minute. So one group was really looking at that question 0, right? And if we're looking at one-step equations with adding, where the variable's value is going to be a whole number or it's not going to be a whole number. We're looking at subtraction, where it is or is not a whole number, multiplication, division, and all of that was wrapped up in question 0. And they were just trying to figure out how to approach that part of the task. And then there was another group that was debating, like, how are we going to get the students to understand the distributive property? Clearly they need to understand that. And then there was a third group that was asking the question, like, do they even need the distributive property? Is that how I want them to do that last question? So it was just really interesting to me that 3 different groups came up with 3 very different places to focus in the same task.
Thank you, Sarah.
And I'm building on that. I can also share that one group that I visited had a really great conversation on how much of a standard do they want to tackle in one set of task cards. It says inequalities, but do we want to go there? And then also for that ground floor, is it maybe more than one question? So not, should it have an addition, a one-step addition, one-step subtraction? And do we put variable on one side, both sides? When do we want to show that? I think that also showed up in the comments too, about rearranging and being flexible and thinking how long it's going to take students to work through each of these tasks.
My one of my groups that I was observing had concerns about, task fatigue. So like how many slices, too many slices. So that was a good thing to share out with everybody else too.
I think everybody has access to all of the group's work, so it's definitely worth taking a look through what everybody else did if you haven't already.
All right.
And speaking of fatigue, so understanding your students is key, because if you have a lot of students with IEPs that are very low level, or ELL students that maybe they haven't had instruction for whatever reason, like, if they come from a war-torn place, or a place where education was not the greatest, you want to build those task 0. So for instance, if you teach high school and you're teaching geometry and you want them to do scaling, well, you need to go back to like those 6th grade standards of ratios, and that could be your task 0.
All right. I think being mindful of our time, we are going to move on to our Q&A part, or we should talk about our contact information, I think. I don't know. William, which one?
So we're just going to jump to the contact information
Okay.
first, just in case people have to hop off the call because it is just about 2:15. So if you have any questions, there are Noyce Fellows across the state of Connecticut, and we are happy to be in touch with you. Kelsey, myself, and Marta's contact information is there. I'm actually going to add a link to the Noyce program website. That way you can sort of see who the other fellows are and where they're located. And so you might be like, oh, Kate's in Hartford and I'm near Hartford. Maybe I reach out to Kate, or like Nicole or anyone. So I'm going to add that link to the landing page so that you can see what fellows are near you and maybe you can reach out to them. There's a QR code here for additional resources. You don't need to necessarily pull out your phone and scan that. The link is also on the landing page. And there is also, and we are asking you to do this when you get a chance, hopefully today, there is a survey at the very bottom of your landing page that says post workshop resources, #1 workshop feedback survey.
And it's
It should
also
take-
in the chat. Marta
It is also
posted
in the
it.
chat. Thank you, Marta. It should definitely take you just a couple minutes. Most of it is Likert scale. So like on a scale of 1 to 5. There's a couple things where it might ask you to explain a couple things, but it's not too long. If you need to hop off because you have other commitments, please feel free to do so. Don't feel like you need to stay on. But if you have questions that you would like to ask, or hear an answer to, feel free to stay on and ask those questions. This is being recorded, so if you need to hop off and you really want to know the answers, eventually this recording will go out, and so perhaps you can jump to the end and listen to those answers that way. And for those of you who have to leave, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you found this beneficial. For those of you who are going to stay, we will start with our Q&A. Do we have anything in our Q&A panel, or can people maybe put it into the chat?
Well, we do have a
Unmute.
question about when this presentation is going to be available. We don't have a specific time just yet, unless Megan, you know how long
I thought we
it
can
will take.
target Friday and that should be
Okay.
reasonable.
Okay.
And feel free to follow up if you don't see it by say Monday. But
Mm-hmm.
we'll try to get that out there quickly.
One question that was in the Q&A,
Website link.
and I can't see it because I had to refresh and I lost it, involved the amount of a quantity of numbers that you put in a task or how you number things in terms of a launch versus one big task. And following up on that idea that it kind of depends on the type of task. So if it's one big task, how you launch it, that minimal amount of writing, just a handful of numbers, and that could be enough to set them free. But then we think of that geometry series of task cards. That's an impossible number of measurements and diagrams to keep track of without some kind of visual aid to keep those numbers straight. So I would, and fellows, please jump in, but I would say it's a fluid scale that you do want to give that minimum amount, but enough that students are going to be able to access each question with minimal additional help from you once you set them free to start.
Another question on the Q&A says, did any of you remove chairs from your room in the beginning of implementation of BTC? So last year I was in a 400 square foot room with a class of 27, a class of 24, 2 classes of 20. It was very tight. So I actually asked for tables and I fit 4 people per table. I also didn't have whiteboard, so I just kind of laminated cardstock, and I kind of use that. For those of you who teach 7th grade, the students were not necessarily the most careful. So if you are forced to do something like that, make sure that you put like cardboard behind and glue it and hot glue it to the walls, because they destroyed my work in like week 2. I spent a whole day doing all that and it was destroyed by the 2nd week.
I actually have a story about the chairs. So I started BTC in May, right after we did our standardized testing back in the spring of 2022. So after an entire year of doing traditional teaching, I decided to try this out. And I had to stack my chairs along the side of the room because my students were so used to the routine of sitting down that they were struggling with the concept of staying up for long periods of time. But when I started BTC from day 1 in September this past school year, and I did it every single day throughout the entire school year, I never had to remove the chairs. It became a routine because I started from day 1, and they just knew and built up the what is the word I'm looking for? The stamina. Also, too, one thing, because they did complain, but I also said, hey guys, I'm standing up with you. Like, I didn't sit down once, and I was like with them in the group. I had heels on, so I was like, guys, if I can do it for 5 classes a day, you can. And they're like, oh yeah, okay. So it helped kind of just to be like, a group effort, and starting from day 1 also helped.
I also did not remove my chairs from my classroom. I'm fortunate that I'm in a pretty large classroom, and so I was using the walls, and I have a lot of windows in my room, so students were writing on the windows. But I didn't remove the chairs, and what I found was that actually my students were standing probably 80% of the class period. And when it was necessary, kids would just go grab a chair and bring it to the board just because they did get tired after 60 minutes of standing. But most of my students were actually really good. A lot of them liked standing. They weren't allowed to stand in their other classes. And especially for my kids with like ADHD, it just was a nice outlet for them. And it also promoted knowledge mobility, just knowing that the kids could walk around doing what they needed to do. But I did find it necessary to not completely get rid of chairs, because like you might have a kid who ends up on crutches one day because they broke their leg. They will need somewhere to sit. Or your kids just get fatigued depending on how long your thin slices are or your activities are.
And I can say for me too, my chairs are attached to my desk, so that wouldn't even be an option for me because of the style of desk that I had. But as I was playing around with rearranging my room, I found it was more important that students have space at the boards. If I had to pick with the size of my room, do I have space in between the groups or do I have space at the boards? And I found that the room became much more comfortable if I sacrificed a little of the navigational space between groups to get that extra foot or so, if not more, at the boards, that space mattered more. And then also keeping it light and keeping it fun. If students do sit and you're putting so much into it, I would say, no, chairs are lava. And even with my high school students, they got a kick out of it. It just took them back to their elementary school days. So keep it fun, keep it light. And I would say, again, space at the boards matters a little bit more than the space in between groups.
We have another question. Should you use BTC for just teaching new concepts or practice as well? I feel like doing it every day would be tedious for teachers and students would get bored doing the same thing each day.
I will jump into that. I taught AP Calculus this past year with thin slices for not thin slices every day, but I did BTC every day except for 2 days. And my students called me out for not using it. My kids did not get tired of it, is what I found. And I know sometimes people will be like, sure, that works at the AP level, but I was working at a school with 10 math teachers. Every single one of the teachers in my department was doing BTC to some extent, and I observed so many classes, and it was always the classes where they were doing something with BTC that the kids were most engaged, having the best conversations. And kids, like when we would survey kids throughout the year, they would be like, yeah, like I don't even I don't like doing math the way that we used to do it last year. And so it takes a little bit of time to sort of get kids acclimated to it, but once they're there, they become the biggest proponents of this.
And you can read the room too, just to jump in as well. One thing that I didn't trust, and then I realized it was a missed thing on my part, and then I started to, was having the launch, having them up with you and circling around you for the launch. That's probably one of the easier things to just fall on more of a traditional launch where they're seating. Okay, guys, they're seated. There it is. They're seated at their desks, and I'm going to set you free when you're ready to start. I would highly recommend trust the process. All right, guys, everybody up. Let's circle up and come up with a phrase that fits for you and make that a non-negotiable, because it will really get their brains going, and launch from different points of the room. So I would pick the back right corner. I would pick the back middle, the front left. Changing that up every day kept it really fresh. But you can read the room. So if you're finding, okay, they're starting right around task 4, I'm feeling a little bit of a dip. Maybe that's an extra synthesis moment where you say, actually, let's just call pause real quick. I would love for everyone to come join me over here and then whatever it is, a great idea, or I'd like to give it a quick 30-second challenge. Can everyone take a second and make a connection between group 2 and group 4? And then all of a sudden you've given them some kind of challenge. So staying flexible for yourself and for them can help with that.
I also want to talk about my experience. So I only have 43 minutes to teach a lesson, and I found it difficult to be able to do an entire task, consolidate notes, and doing the check for understanding questions. So I, over the past year, adapted a method where I would do the lessons in a 2-day format. So day 1, I would do a task at the boards. I would take photographs of their work. We would have a mini consolidation, but the consolidation and note part would happen on the second day after. So they would come to class the next day. I would have a Google Slides with selected photos of the boards that I picked from the day before. We would have a discussion, and that could have been standing up by the TV because I have a TV in my room, or we could have them sitting. It was a group discussion. They were recording notes in their notebooks, and then they would have a worksheet for their check for understanding questions. And so that changed it up for me as well. So I found that was a good system and worked well with my time frame.
So Mike, I hope that that answered your question. You talked about having 42-minute classes. I'm on the same boat.
And that doesn't mean that you have to do thin slicing for the whole class. Maybe it's like 20 or 30 minutes. Maybe you're doing it once a week. A lot of my teachers in my department aimed for like once every week or once every other week. So you're going to sort of see what works really well for your students and what doesn't work well. And right, you will always know your students better than anyone else. So you sort of just have to do what works with your kids.
Yeah, I'll just add to what you said because I was really nervous that I wasn't able to do what Kelsey did and like what you did and do it every single day. So I couldn't achieve that consistency. And I was worried that that would mean my students wouldn't be as good at doing this. Like they wouldn't have good habits. They wouldn't collaborate as well. They wouldn't remember to stand up. They wouldn't be able to find, all the logistical problems. And I found that that wasn't the case at all. Even doing it once a week, they were still like, as soon as I was like, we're working on our whiteboards today, they were right on it. They knew what to do. They were collaborating. So it's still very workable as a model, even if you're not doing it every day.
Yeah, and you can think of this as another tool in your toolbox. Like, for instance, I used gallery walks or problems on different spots of the room, or sometimes I would take them to the hallway. Sometimes we would go outside. It doesn't have to be that this is the way that you have to do it every single day.
I want to also make a note too, kind of to go off of what Sarah was saying. And I found a post on the Building Thinking Classrooms Facebook group, which I would highly recommend joining if you haven't. But it says to build a habit and to do something new, we need to do it. Not just plan and study and think about it. We have to actually go out and implement these lessons. And you learn something more by actually doing it and feeling the vibe of the room and changing it up, realizing what a thin slice is, what a thick slice is. And you just have to experience it. And as you go, reflect as a teacher and reflect on what you've done and just improve it for the next lesson, the next day, or the next week, or the next unit, or the next year. And it will get better with time. So you just have to just do it.
It's also really helpful to be very collaborative with your students and to say, we're going to try this today and we're going to see how it goes. And then try it. We always ask them to reflect and adjust. And I think as teachers, if we announce to students that we're going to do the same, it gives you more freedom to be flexible in the moment. So if something's not going well, you think you designed the best series of task cards ever, and it's not, then you can just call a pause and say, thank you so much for trying that with me. It gave me some really great things to think about. We may revisit this tomorrow, but right now we're going to pivot and try something else. That's okay.
Yes, I had to do that when all my boards were destroyed. We were like, okay, well, the randomizing was still going to happen. That's something that they fought me at the beginning of the year. They wanted to only work with their friends. So I used a deck of cards, and it was a teaching experience for a group of students that somehow they thought that they were going to fool me, that for 3 days in a row, they ended up in the same group. So I was like, no, you guys are switching cards. And they fessed up. They were like, yes, I just want to work with this person. That's my friend. And I was like, well, you don't know who else you're going to meet. And you're getting an experience that you're going to have to bring to the rest of your life. You don't always work with your bestie.
Actually, I'm glad you re-mentioned that your boards got destroyed, because there's something I wanted to say on that. Norm set respecting your classroom space. I think that's something that gets done extensively at the elementary school level, and sometimes we don't do it as much at the high school level. And when you're not personally investing in your space in ways that students affect the space, not as important. But when you're setting up your classrooms, you're putting up your boards, you're putting up all of these different things for them to be successful at their groups, and that needs to stay nice for the entire school year across your entire day. I think really investing in norm setting that we respect our space, we're going to take care of our space, and whatever that means for you, right? You have to personalize your lingo and your toolbox for what that's going to look like. That will really, 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 really help this be successful long term.
And Kelsey had put into the additional resources folder that's linked on your landing page some norms that she got, I think, from the Facebook group, right?
I did, and it's in the folder for you guys.
I think
Yeah,
this would
it's
be
a-
a great time. I think we should probably wrap it up because it's 2:30 and we can invite people. You have email contacts, you have ways to get in touch with others. So I don't know, Kelsey, William, Marta, any concluding comments?
Thank you all so much for taking time out of your final days of summer to join us. I'm really excited to see how many people are excited about this kind of work. Do not hesitate to reach out. I added at the very bottom of the landing page a link to the website so you can see what Noyce Fellows are in your area. And then please fill out the feedback survey, which includes on the last page other topics that you would maybe be interested in having future workshops about. So we very much value your feedback. Whatever you're giving us, these are opportunities for us to grow so that we can provide improved workshops whenever we're able to.
Yes, thank you so much for your time and joining us.
Yes, thank you. I have linked the feedback form once again on the chat in case you missed it.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Best wishes
Awesome.
as you start up a new year.
Bye.
Bye.
And thank you to all of our facilitators that came and helped.
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes.
I have done it without you guys.
Mhm. Bye.
Bye.
All right.
You guys did a good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.